Those of you who know me know that I've been long obsessed with grizzlies. I've also been fascinated ever since college with conservation icon, philosopher, and scientist Aldo Leopold that has been mentioned earlier. And my interest in him and his work was renewed recently when I met his only surviving offspring, Stella Leopold, who's also a world-class scientist and an incredible environmental activist. Who's, by the way, featured in my most recent blog, and actually the first of 4 podcasts on Grizzly Times is with her. But in the 1920s, preceding Bud Moore's very interesting quotes, and Gary and I did not coordinate on this, it just was sort of happenstance. In the 1920s, Aldo Leopold describes grizzly bears as the outstanding achievement of the pageant of evolution. And in an essay in Sand County Almanac, Leopold tells the tragic tale of a grizzly bear they called Old Bigfoot, one of the last grizzly bears in Arizona, who was killed on Mount Escadilla. And he said this: "The government trapper who took the grizzly knew that he made Escadilla safe for cows. He did not know he had toppled the spire off an edifice, a building, since the morning stars sang together. Escadilla still hangs on the horizon, but when you see it, you no longer think of bears. It's only a mountain now." So we have the Endangered Species Act and incredible vast public lands to thank for the fact that grizzly bears did not vanish in the northern Rockies as they did on Escadilla. Although in the Selway Bitterroot and the Big Wild, as I know a number of you like to call it, is a poorer place because we've slaughtered grizzly bears. And as David and Gary said, the last known grizzly bear was killed in 2007 by the hunter over glazed donuts, hunting for black bears. And every year in the northern Rockies now, 1 or more grizzlies are killed in mistaken identity, confusion over black bear hunting, confused with a black bear, and often over bait, at least in Idaho, glazed donuts or rotten fruit. The practice, needless to say, is illegal for everyone else using our public lands, but black bear hunters. The point of the Endangered Species Act is that it protects the interests of all Americans. Even though we have to remind the states and the federal government of that at times, through letters, lobbying politicians, public protest, and even at times going to court. But more and more families are flocking to places like Yellowstone and Glacier in the hopes of catching a glimpse of a grizzly bear or a wolf. Even as citizens from across the country are expressing their support for the recovery of an animal that is seen as the icon of the wild and a living reminder of what this continent was like when European settlers first arrived. And many people are horrified that after working so hard for so long under the terms of the Endangered Species Act, that the states of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming want to turn around and allow hunting of grizzlies and reverse the hard-fought progress made over the last 40 years. Of course, this is an all too familiar tale for those of you in Idaho who are watching the war on wolves through aerial gunning, almost unlimited killing, and maybe soon even boosted with a wolf bounty. For 10 years, I was part of a grassroots organizing effort, and some of you probably in this room were too, that brought wolves back to Yellowstone in 1995. And I re-engaged in the wolf debate in the run-up to the delisting, the disastrous delisting of wolves in 2011 that has led to the slaughter of about 4,000 wolves now in the Northern Rockies since that time. Wolves are a case in point, showing why states in the northern Rockies are unable to conserve large carnivores, and why wolves and grizzlies, not to mention lynx and wolverine, should never be removed from the Endangered Species Act protections or some comparable science-based federal protections. Last summer, Estella Leopold, who was 93, confessed that her father would roll over in his grave at what is going on with wolves and grizzly bears. And the Leopolds are not alone. Time and time again, the public has made it clear that hunting and wanton killing of large carnivores is wrong. In the case of grizzly bears, roughly 99.99% of the nearly 1 million comments that were submitted in 2016 on the proposed delisting, removal of Endangered Species Act protections for the Yellowstone grizzly bear, 99.99% of the people who commented to the government opposed that move. But that was consistent also with 2 decades previously in over a dozen processes where the same overwhelming opposition to trophy hunting and wanton killing was also expressed. But the government barged ahead anyway. Also in 2016, as this public comment process was underway, a tribal grizzly bear treaty opposing delisting and supporting recovery of grizzly bears on tribal land was crisscrossing the country from coast to coast, from Canada to the Mexican border and back again. And it was signed by over 270 tribes, even those who had been some sworn enemies who abandoned their differences in the shared interest of trying to keep grizzly bears from becoming rogues. From time immemorial, grizzly bears have been seen across the globe. There is really a shared story of grizzly bears as teachers, as guides, as mentors, and as healers. So needless to say, the idea of killing your grandmother and putting her head on a wall was an anathema. But of course, the government barged ahead anyway and delisted in 2017 grizzly bears for the second time in a decade, and was hauled to court by tribes and conservation groups. Last summer was an amazing hearing in court over this. And again, the Endangered Species Act prevailed in a ruling last fall that restored endangered species protections to Yellowstone grizzly bears. But importantly, the ruling also called the government on a flawed approach to the maintenance of still isolated grizzly bear populations, which should put a spotlight again on the potential and the importance for recovery of grizzly bears here in the Selway-Bitterroot region. And as David said, and Gary too, grizzly bears are showing with their own paws that they can make it here. Grizzly bears in the sapphires, grizzly bears virtually on the edge of this ecosystem and maybe even in it now again. So with that in mind, I just want to mention briefly 3 areas, I think, of importance and opportunity. First, the Fish and Wildlife Service. Grizzly Bear Recovery Coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Hillary Cooley, expressed in the newspapers last fall when they unceremoniously removed Arnie from the Stevensville golf course, she expressed concern about how that situation was handled. And that's important because the 2000 Environmental Impact Statement of the Fish and Wildlife Service supporting grizzly bear recovery is still on the books. Fish and Wildlife Service is still on the record as wanting support, as supporting grizzly bear recovery here. And snatching up innocent Arnies for no more serious crime than is committed by a lot of bad golfers doesn't make sense. We should be rolling out the welcome mat. And even former Fish and Wildlife Service Director Dan Esch called grizzly bear recovery in the Selway-Bitterroot ecosystem the brass ring of recovery of the grizzly bear. But as usual, it will be up to us, Friends of the Clearwater groups, the Palouse Environmental Sustainability Coalition, other groups here in this room and elsewhere. It will be up to us to hold the government's feet to the fire and advance that conversation. To the U.S. Forest Service, a second area of opportunity. As you all know, probably, the revision of the Nez Perce Clearwater Forest forest plan is underway, kind of bumbling along, delays and one step forward and one step back, perhaps. But three important issues and opportunities to address grizzly bears in that: food storage, roads, and roadless areas. Foods first. It doesn't make sense that the requirements of food storage only extend here to the Frank Church River of No Return and the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, when, as we know, black bears that become food conditioned to garbage die at far higher rates. Why does sensible food storage requirement have to come on the back of the Endangered Species Act? It's just logic. It is just common sense. So the forest plan has an opportunity. In the forest plan, we have an opportunity to insist, these being our lands, that we institute responsible food storage requirements on the entire forest for all wildlife, which of course would be also rolling out the welcome mat to grizzly bears and making it easier for them to survive. It's simply the right thing to do. Similarly, David mentioned the issue of roads. And groups like Friends of the Clearwater has been dealing with roads and the problems of excessive roads on this forest for a very long time. And the road standards, which that exist today, deal primarily with elk habitat effectiveness and protecting fish, may be fine as far as they go, but they're poorly implemented, haphazardly implemented, and they could be stronger, as we have seen on forests like the Flathead and Greater Yellowstone forests, where we have much more rigorous standards to protect grizzly bears, and while they're doing it, also protect elk and a whole slew of other species. We could be doing better. So it would be interesting if the Forest Service, in its revision of the forest plan, were to look at basically adopting what has been done in the Flathead and in Yellowstone forests with these Forest Service standards, looking at what that would look like. What would that mean in terms of road closures, access, what have you? I remember many years ago when we were fighting it out with the Targhee National Forest in eastern Idaho, with Idaho Fish and Game over elk management and grizzly bear management, that the basically convergence of ideas were the same, that we were concerned about similar road densities. It makes sense. Again, good road standards shouldn't have to come back on the back of grizzly bears or the Endangered Species Act. We should be taking a look at what some of the other more proactive forests are doing elsewhere in the region and apply them here, because it would improve the prospects of grizzly bears surviving if they get here under their own steam. It simply makes sense. Similarly, roadless areas. I know the Friends of the Clearwater, many other of you are dedicated to the cause of protecting roadless areas, and I know there is a petition somewhere.
Here we
go. Okay. If you haven't signed it, this is a petition to protect the remaining roadless areas on the Nez Perce Clearwater, and it's been signed by a number of people, but if you haven't signed it, it's going down around the room now, because that's the flip side of it's not just enough to have decent road standards in place on the roaded land base of the national forest lands. You also have to have strong protection of remaining existing roadless areas. So sort of the flip side of the same coin. Lastly, tribes and tribal land. In the working with the tribes over the last 6 years or so on the Yellowstone delisting issue, and looking at maps of tribal treaty claims, treaty rights, and tribal lands, I've been really struck by the opportunity that exist on tribal lands and lands to which tribes have legitimate current claims as to the possibility of reconnecting some of these landscapes. It was sort of stunning to me beginning to look at the possibilities for connectivity through the lens of the tribes. And that, of course, was at the root of some of the language in the 2016 treaty, which was all about the cultural and spiritual value of grizzly bears and getting them, where suitable, back on tribal lands. And with an enormous amount of enthusiasm and support. And then you had, so of course there are lots of tribes with grizzly bears now, the Salish Kootenai in Montana, the Blackfeet in Wyoming, the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho on the Wind River Reservation, where grizzly bears are now. But their potential for other lands is incredible. And the Northern Cheyenne last year stepped forward and said, rather than sending grizzly bears to their death, so-called problem bears, we'll take them. Which I thought was really intriguing. And I think the tribes deserve an important seat at the table now. They certainly sat at the table in court with a number of us last year. And it's a still ongoing slugfest as the case is going up on appeal to the Ninth Circuit now. But the tribes have an important role to play and are exercising their interest, asserting their interest in a different future for the grizzly bear and for themselves culturally and spiritually for such an important animal. So I think we have the opportunity to collectively move forward on a shared vision, an alternative vision for the recovery of the grizzly bear, even as groups like Safari Club International and the NRA move forward with the states in appealing the ruling that restored endangered species protections to Yellowstone grizzly bears. No one, I think, describes the current challenge better than Leopold when he said, "Youth yet unborn will pole up the Missouri with Lewis and Clark, or climb the Sierras with James Cap'n Adams," who was Grizzly Adams, "and each generation in turn will ask, where is the big white bear? It will be a sorry answer to say he went under when conservationists weren't looking." Thank you.
Well,